how do we identify progress and success when we evaluate? So objectives achieved or targets met, like the SDG targets, will we say we're successful then? Or maybe if stakeholder expectations are met, theories of change confirmed, right? Compliance with some work plan, compliance with some results that and milestones that we expect throughout. When we get positive outcomes, some improvements, some percentage of improvements, or something that we all probably know, satisfactory rating when we evaluate according to some criteria. And there are usually what's called the OECD DAC criteria, sustainability and all those things. So when we see these things being met or being done or outcomes achieved, are we then successful? No. Because we do not look at everything that make for success. And so what we tend to do is we tend to look at usually programs or policies or projects, usually in isolation of everything else. We may have a theory of change that has a high-level link to, let's say, development or national policy or national plans, but those are usually quite tenuous, those linkages. And a lot of what we evaluate in our programs are very good, but the point is, can we say, for example, that if we met the 5 DAC criteria, or 4 of the 5, or 3 of the 5 to some extent, we got impact? Maybe they're sustainable, they are sort of relevant. They can even be effective. Can we say that we have a success story? And my thesis is no. And I want to go through that logic. We let stakeholders determine to a great extent what we evaluate, right? It's what stakeholders want to know. It's utilization-focused evaluation, and so on. Stakeholders, commissioners, and then all the participants, many donors, and governments, and people on the ground. I mean, it's a huge variety. And I don't think that they always ask the right questions. I think we are too dependent on stakeholders asking the right questions. And I think that we are too narrow in the kind of criteria that we believe actually should be looked at. So, my thesis today is that we should look beyond how to what and on what basis we evaluate, and of course using whose values, in order to judge development, progress, and success. So it's not anymore about policy or program evaluation. It's time to move very clearly beyond that. It's not anymore about the use of the DAC criteria or any criteria narrowly selected. Because we should remember the era in which evaluation was kind of born as a practice. And even though it's evolved since the 50s, some people say it started in 1880 as a formal practice. But, it's around just after the war when, especially in the US, to have government programs evaluated. So we must remember that that was the era in which evaluation was born as a systematic practice. And we are today in this era, right? And this era looks very different. I mean, these pictures are symbolic. I'm sure you can identify them. The one at the left top corner is competition in the world, competition between countries. Globalization and what it brought, mostly competition for resources. The fourth industrial revolution, the merging of technology with people and with nature, and technology playing an incredibly important role increasingly so. Many people talk about the humane economy that we need as a counterpoint to the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution, and our phones that take away being human from us. And then, of course, climate change. And among all of this, the thing we tend to focus on is the Sustainable Development Goals. But there are so many more things in the world that are influencing what goes on in the world. So our life today and how we view something like our country's development, it's very different today to what it was. Everything is speeding up and everything is very complicated. So what does this new era mean for us in evaluation? First of all, it means that there are now macro, cross-boundary, many cross-boundary influences on power in the world and on progress. Now, this doesn't mean that it wasn't there before, of course, but it is now perhaps more visible. But it's also because there are so many shifts in the world. Power has been shifting, resources have been shifting, knowledge has been shifting from west to east, for example. And there are macro influences like climate change and many other things that are now affecting us very visibly. We have massive monopolies, right? There are hedge funds that command trillions of dollars. And you all know the Oxfam statistics of 48 people now owning as much as the lowest. We all know those. And the global value chains that really determine who gets what and what goes on in trade and in many other arenas. And much of the disruptions that we have through technology are being accelerated because of the interlinkage of everything and everybody. There's an aggressive increase in competition for resources, and one can see it in the increasing number of wars and conflicts around the world. It's got nothing to do with the nice things like human rights and democracy. It's about competition for power and competition for resources. Cynical view, but it's close to reality. So there's also much greater diversity in how we think about development, in how we think about how to approach the way in which our countries need to move forward. So there are new models, and typically there are success stories, especially in Asia, to some extent in Africa, that are built on completely different models to what has been espoused in the development environment for many years, right? And you have countries like Korea and Singapore, but you also have China as a very obvious and very excellent example. You've got new actors like the private sector that are big time moving into evaluation, but not evaluation as we know it. And there's alliances, networks, global powerhouses of networked organizations or networked cities that are changing the nation-state dynamic. Right. And importantly, development is now relevant to everyone. So those of you who know me know that I still talk very much about the global south and the global north, because that distinction is still there, and the statistics prove it. Right? But it doesn't mean that one is inferior to the other. It means that we have major intensity differences. Right? Everything is much more intense in the south, the good and the bad. And the interesting thing is that the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, say very clearly that development now is everybody's responsibility. Also in the UK government has a development responsibility because within our countries there's a lot of inequality, there are a lot of complex problems. It's not anymore something that the South does in order to get to where the North is, right? Everybody has to think about development. So when I use the term development today, it's for all of us relevant. Even though there's still very distinct challenges. I always say that planning and evaluation in the South is so much more difficult, so much more burning issues and difficult things to do there. So some of you may have seen this, very interesting. It's progress with the SDGs. Where are we today as countries? The one on the left is Europe. I'm so sorry that you can't see it. But these are many different countries. And these are the SDGs from 1 to, I think this is all of them, or I can't actually see. This looks like 15. Anyways, a lot of them. So this is Europe. This is, I think, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and this is Africa. Red, as usual, is where the SDGs are far from having been met, and green is where they are being met, with yellow and orange in between. And you can see the very interesting pattern, right? So, I mean, just look at Europe, look at all the reds. That's why Europe needs to develop. But the reds are towards the right, and those of you who know the SDGs will know that this is the global issues, right? It's climate change and, you know, those, let's call it almost the environment-related things, overconsumption as a result. And so if you look at Africa, those are education, health, poverty, and so on. Our pattern is very clear, isn't it? So the things that we need to develop in, of course, are not quite the same, but we all carry responsibility from a global perspective. So just to emphasize from the same study that was done, it's just been published. You will see your own responsibility in the UK. At least 5 of the SDGs are still underdeveloped, and there are a few oranges as well. So there's a lot of work to do here to develop as well. Let me see. You are number 16 out of the 157 countries. UK is not doing badly at all. And this is your performance by SDG. So you can, this is a nice graph to show where exactly you are going over the boundaries of consumption and so on. Very interesting data. So the point is we all need to develop. Next point then is that it's, as we know, there's an urgency now that there hasn't been some decades ago. There's an urgency, we understand much more about the global challenges that we all face. And so our planetary boundaries are actually under siege. You probably know Kate Raworth's donut model, donut economics, right? So where you have social, what makes for well-being in a country is the inner circle, and the outer circle is the planetary boundaries within which we need to develop. And it's very interesting to see how there's not even one country that have been staying within planetary boundaries. So there's some urgency to resolving things like environmental and other challenges that we have, and climate change, of course, being part of that. And then really a focus for what I want to talk about or refer to today is there's obviously an increasing focus and understanding of the need for integration, the need for a holistic approach to things, including development, right? Now, none of this is new to you, I'm sure, but the focus that we now have, should have, also in evaluation, is to view development and therefore evaluation through a complex adaptive systems lens. Now, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of that. I'm sure some of you know much better than me what exactly that means. And there's so much already written about it. But this is really where I will be coming from in the rest of what I say, is that number 7, that we need to view both development and, as a result, evaluation through a complex adaptive systems lens. Now, we all have our ideas what's the value of evaluation and what is the value proposition that different people may have, right? So, for many reasons and for many purposes, evaluation can enable immediate or near real-time experience and evidence-informed insight, learning, and judgment, right? I think that's a critical value add or value proposition of evaluation. It's really important. Research doesn't do that, right? So it can build confidence that policies, decisions, strategies, and so on are good, or are at least reasonably well thought through. It can also, of course, inform changes and changing strategies, changing activities, both through self and independent evaluation, right? It's like reality testing. And something that we underemphasize, but that's really important, it can help manage risks, right? So this is the current value proposition in my view. We all interpret these things differently. But in this new era, what is evaluation's value proposition? Given what I just said about the challenges that the world face and that we face in each of our countries. So my view is that the value that we have to add as a practice is to identify, to support, to cultivate progress and success towards positive development trajectories. I'm talking about as a country, as a region, let's say Africa, or as a global planet, right? A positive development trajectory. We don't think often enough about trajectories. Now, when you are DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the trajectory that you have to maintain, to get and maintain, in order to, let's say, achieve the SDG is tremendously challenging and steep. So many things have to work together at the right time, right? So you have education and health and so on. You can't really resolve them one by one in bits and pieces. So much of it has to work together in order to advance that country along a positive trajectory until it can say comfortably that we now have achieved sustainable development and we're contributing globally to sustained development or sustainable development. In the UK, you have to do so much less, but still there are some things that you may have to tweak and maybe even in some cases really try to change in order to make sure, I think your health system, for example, I see there's a lot of writing about your health system that needs to improve. Your education system is very good, but you know it's more sector linked and it's maybe more programmatic, and that trajectory that one needs to work towards is already pretty okay. So one may just need a bit of a rise in some of the SDGs. So for me, it's very important that we think about trajectories and what it means to develop along a positive trajectory. So for me, then it's very important that we are, if we try to do this number 4 that I have there, we have to be very clear about the values, the models, the ideologies against which we evaluate. I'll come back to that later. We need in how we evaluate, we need to support risk management in a way that is cognizant of sometimes hidden things, hidden power asymmetries, for example, things that are not very obvious, and the sometimes hidden impacts of macro influences, of disasters, of disruptions, and also, as I mentioned right in the beginning, potentially negative, neutralising consequences or impacts, or what economists call spillover effects. Now, I'm a chemist by training. My PhD was in chemistry, so I tend to use chemistry language, catalytic and neutralising, but I'm sure you know what I mean by neutralising is if you've got positive outcomes, but there are negative ones that are severe, they can easily neutralise, cancel each other out. And yet we don't think in those terms, right? So then finally, the focus on that we really need is a focus on large systems change. Now, transformational change is already a fuzzword. You know, nobody knows exactly what it means, and it's beyond a buzzword. It's also quite essential that we try to grapple and understand, right? And that means that we need to think about large systems and not about programs and projects. Right? And that does challenge us. And transformational change, there are now some efforts ongoing in the evaluation sphere to try to understand how one identifies transformational change and how you get it, and how you evaluate for it. We don't really know yet, because transformational change can consist of a number of incremental changes, slow changes, the very well-known Chinese saying of we follow the path through the river by walking the stones. So a lot of incremental changes can lead to transformational change, can be catalytic. One small effort can lead to big change if it's a very particular pathway. And collective action, major collective action, can support transformational change. These are the kinds of things we have to grapple with. Now, all of this actually relates to complex adaptive systems. And even though I'm not going to go into the detail, the technical detail of that, do keep that in mind. Because my thesis, I have to repeat, is that in what we evaluate and on what basis we evaluate, we need to be more mindful of complex systems. I just put on a lot of books and articles, and there's a lot of work going on. Go and read, if you haven't read it yet, some really good stuff being written about the whole issue of complex systems and what it means in evaluation. And we've got a lot of methodologies that one can apply that's becoming available. So a lot of work has gone and is going into it. I mean, the outcome mapping was published in 2002. We already had our first workshop in South Africa on that with IDRC. Many of these things are not new. We have a lot of tools and things we can apply, right? So I'm not going to talk about those. I want to point out, though, that the first thing that I feel will mislead is if we do not view it from this perspective. And I put just a few of the characteristics. I'm sure you know these things, but I just remind us some of the characteristics of complex systems. And I will refer to some of them. But we have to be acquainted with what this does mean for our practice. And a very good book, which you probably know, is Ben Ramalingham's book, Aid on the Edge of Chaos. And evaluating a program and saying that we have obtained impact is limited value unless we know a lot of other things, right? And the first point I want to make about this is not that impact is not important. It's important. But it's also very important that we link and we evaluate not just impact, but what we evaluate how design and implementation can be more thoughtfully evaluated in order to get impact, in order to ensure impact. It's not about process evaluation. It's not about just looking at how something is implemented. It's looking at design and implementation from a complex adaptive system perspective. In my next slides, do keep in mind that everything that I refer to can be evaluated at the design stage, and we have to do that, and also during implementation. So it's now time to really move beyond this thing that if we can say we've had impact, we've been successful. And it's also not just about adaptive management, because a lot of people now think that complex systems means that you need to apply adaptive management, right? Yes, but that's not enough. There are other things we need to think about. much more carefully in line with complex systems thinking. So I have only 3 issues that I quickly want to run through in somewhat greater detail that all relate to what I just said. So one of the most misleading things in evaluation is delinking impact from the significance of the impact, however we don't want to define that, from its sustainability. So that's why I said impact alone is meaningless. If that impact is not sustainable, if it's not going to be sustained, or if it's not proven to have sustained or have led to other things that are positive, and then the impact by itself is useless. And when we evaluate, I'm sure some of you know that, because we so often go out and after a year, after a month sometimes, there's nothing left of what had been done. Now this is an old issue, this is not a new issue. But what I see is that we evaluate impact and we evaluate sustainability, and we say, oh, a lot of impact, oh, sustainability, not so good. Is that a success then? I would say no. So for development trajectories, you need impacts that are either sustained or that ripple out into other positive impacts that over a long time will lead to a positive development trajectory. And we need to be cognizant of that in what we evaluate and how we evaluate. And I just put there at the bottom that this relates to the interlinked nature of things. It relates to emergence, to self-organization. And one can make those linkages, but I'm not going to do it now. So how do we judge success? If we say there's 5% improvement, a lot of randomized controlled trials, for example, give us a fairly small percentage of improvement. Is it then a success? Is it something that we should feel comfortable about? What criteria do we use to be sure that we can say that this is something that's really useful? Similarly, again, nuances in data that need to be carefully thought through, negative consequences. Public schools, this is just a quote from an evaluation. I didn't put the reference there, I see. Something improved by 60%, right? It's public schools raised student learning by 60% compared to public schools, but the costs were high. Performance varied across operators. Contracts authorized the largest operator to push pupils who don't perform back to public schools, right? If we don't evaluate for those things, if we're not alert to them, we would think it's a massive success, 60% increase. So, it comes back to what we evaluate and on what basis. So China, I'd wanted to say much more about China, and I realized that there's not time, and I'll write about that, or there's a lot to be learned about evaluation when we study China. And we don't do that enough, so I'll talk about that another time. But I do want to show you this. The picture on the left was taken in 1964, but actually in 1980s when Shenzhen started to develop. So that was Shenzhen in 1980, and that is what it is today on the right-hand side. And those of you who have been to China will know the incredible transformation in so many parts of the country. Now, the point I want to make here is a very obvious and very familiar point. The challenge of sustaining a development trajectory in a country of 1 billion people over 30 to 40 years is tremendous. So many things must happen at the same time to move from what is on the left to what is on the right in order to lift 700 million people out of poverty. It's never been done in the history of the world. So it's an incredible success story in many ways. At the same time, we have the trade-offs that we all know about, the environment. On what basis do we judge success? All right? How do we think about success in that context? will we have alerted them, if we were to evaluate some of the economic and other development strategies, would we have alerted them to the environmental damage? Or would we have accepted that as a trade-off for fast economic growth that can be fixed later? That's the values and the models against which we evaluate. And if we can't do that, if we don't do that, how powerful are we in the judgments we make? Now, a very critical issue, and probably the most important one that I can put forward, and that's also probably best known to us all, is the issue of coherence. Now, from a systems perspective, this is a very important issue. It's often been seen as you must make sure that the policies in a country are aligned, the programs don't conflict, and so on, right? And of course, the same can be said between countries. So it doesn't help, on the one hand, that aid is given by a country when trade takes away, right? So there's been a lot of calls for alignment of policy and that there's coherence in strategies within countries and between countries, right? Now, just to discuss this in a little bit more depth in terms of synergistic effects, because that, as a chemist for me, is also very important. You know the system saying the whole is more than the sum of the parts, right? So it's a very well-known thing. So one needs programs to build on one another in order to be more than the sum of the individual efforts. So I was recently in the Mekong, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and so on. That whole area there has a lot of migration, migrant workers. And so the International Labour Organization had a lot of programs active there, and some of them were cognizant of the others. So they tried to align in order to emphasize, maybe to reach the same population, or to have complementary strategies. There were others that ran completely separately and completely not knowing about one another, actually in some cases, potentially causing some conflicts, right? So unless we do evaluate, even when we do a program evaluation, for whether that program is building on others or others are building on it, we are missing the whole point of systems thinking, right? Now, it can be positive. I used migration. I worked for some years with a women's empowerment program, women scientists across 11 African countries. And we found out that they had 8 strategies that worked hand in hand within one program. You know, the one strategy would develop certain skills, another one would build confidence, another one would give exposure, another one would enhance influence, and so on. They built on one another so that in the end the impact accelerated because of that positive cycle that was created, right? So we need to look at those kind of things, and we need to be aware of how they're reinforcing feedback loops, for example. And then it can also be negative. For example, Naila Kabir gave not long ago a very good presentation, those of you who know her, about how the intersecting inequalities of race, gender, and so on, the identity issues, when they intersect with resource issues like poverty, the synergistic effect of these things it accelerates the situation. So in India, you will find that women from low castes, for example, are in a much worse position than women, very obviously, from a middle class environment. But she makes a very good case with very good statistics about how the negative synergies reinforce the acceleration of negative a negative situation. Right? And then the historical coherence. It's not just that we need to evaluate, when we evaluate projects, we must look at what goes on around it. We must also look at historical coherence. The first two is horizontal, vertical, internal, and so on. It's all in that book on the right, very good book, by the way, by Bamberger and Jos Wassen, and so on. Historical coherence. Things must also happen in a certain sequence. As I said, DRC was a good example of many things that need to happen in sequence to make the positive trajectory grow. Again, in the Mekong, if I can use the same example, it doesn't help, as it happened in one of those countries, it doesn't help that one puts a social support system in place, and the contribution that has to be made by people cannot be made because their poverty is still too big. You must also, hand in hand, develop economical advancement, obviously. So their social safety network had to stop for a while until they could actually get people more economically developed, right? And again, unless we are cognizant of these kinds of things, we are fooling ourselves when we say a program has been successful. Was it also timely? Does it build on what has gone before? And then, what did I just do? And then vertical coherence. That's also something that's just come out yesterday or a few days ago, is a draft global compact for migration. That is one that's been developed by OECD countries together with some other actors, the World Bank and others, I think. I speak under correction, I still have to study it. But the AU's Common African Position, there's real conflict between African perspectives on migration issues and let's call it the rich countries' perspectives. Real disconnects. So one also needs the vertical coherence from local to global. Right? Then just to very quickly refer to potentially neutralising, the fact that we have to be far more careful in evaluating for potentially negative consequences and impacts. We need to have negative theories of change, why we think things may go wrong, and evaluate accordingly. It's not just asking one little question, did you feel any negative impacts? It's about far more. And I just gave a small example, but we all know the very obvious examples. You have a youth program in a country where the distance between youth and elders is big, so you disturb the whole fabric of society with your youth programs in rural areas because the elder people feel excluded. What are we prepared to tear the fabric of that society with our interventions? Or are we then also making sure that the elders are looked after, or don't we care? Should we care? Right? We can't just say a youth program is a success because we achieved a set of objectives. Using a lens of interdependence, and this relates back to what had gone before, because this is really what had gone before relates to the interdependence and connections between things. This report on the right, I don't know how many of you know it. If you don't, it's extremely useful. It was developed by ICSU, the International Council for Science, together with some academics from all around the world. And they did a framework for understanding the SDG interactions. How many of you know this report? I don't want to bore you. It's a brilliant piece of work. Brilliant. Really brilliant. Very, very useful. There too. What it says is that it made an analysis of which of the goals and targets on the left-hand side cancel one another out, counteract, constrain, are consistent, or reinforce, or are so reinforcing that they actually become indivisible. So it gives one an instrument, also as in evaluation. I'm sorry, this is, of course, not to study the detail, but basically they gave a rating of -3 if the targets would be in conflict with one another. Very typically, economic and environmental targets are easily in conflict. So it's maybe a -2 or a -3. They analyzed it based on experience or reasoning, case studies. Or +3 if it's very reinforcing, it's very synergistic in a positive way, right? And so they came to all sorts of wonderful things like SDG 2, the agriculture one, compared to SDG 6, for example, or SDG 13. There's no time to go into detail, but they clearly show where they reinforce one another, where they oppose one another. And if you synthesize it in the end, and they did it for 5 or so of the SDGs, 4 or 5, you can very clearly see where there's potential for negative impacts, or where you have to have strategies that address the potential for conflicting targets and conflicting goals. Right? So the ones here are reinforcing. So if you would have SDG 1, certain targets are reinforcing one another, and SDG 1, 3, and 5, especially 5, which is women, the gender SDG, gender and poverty, and so on, all above the line, they would reinforce one another, the targets. But they are targets that if the people try to achieve them would constrain or conflict. And so your strategies can adjust accordingly. And we can use that in evaluation also to understand how we can study and understand negative constraints and reinforcing synergistic aspects. All I'm saying is there are ways and tools and things that we can use to work with. Another misleading one, and I have to rush now, another misleading issue is the fact that we very often have insufficient engagement with the values, the assumptions, and the theories underlying development models, right? And I'm talking now about the big picture. And so we have theories of change, but one will see that their link to development is often very difficult and very tenuous. But also, do we question development models? Now, the structural adjustment programs would be one. Those of you, I'm sorry, there's no time to explain you, those of you who don't know it, but basically it said open your markets, poor countries. And what happened is that a lot of resources went out because the markets were open to competitors that were much stronger, and the countries couldn't control that. A lot of complicated analyses around it. I'm sure many of you know that very well. And there are pros and cons, but there were a lot of cons. Would we have been able to question the model of development? Or how far can we do that? Now, one that is at the moment very prominent is the whole issue of the circular economy. Right? So I'm sure many of you know, again, the donut, and again, there's no time for detail, but the social foundation, if you live with the ideal is in all these social dimensions, you have to achieve the inner circle. This is the economic and ecological ceiling. So if you go over this green line, you go beyond what the planet can bear, right? And therefore there's a need for the circular economy that goes away from overconsumption into reusing stuff and stopping waste. An analysis was done for the UK specifically. You're only 19% circular, so a lot of waste. And you're probably doing better than most countries. The question is, if you evaluate a program that is about economic development, are you going to make reference, can we make reference to the fact that one needs to stay within a circular economy, even if it's not explicit in your terms of reference, right? Or do we think about that, right? Here is the UK on the left and Thailand on the right, about the same number of people in the country. And you can see the UK is already living far beyond the means of the planet, right? These are CO2 emissions, material footprints, ecological footprint, where Thailand is very much within that, right? So these are the kinds of urgent things that we need to keep in mind when we evaluate. But can we? Do we? And if we don't, what are the implications for the power that we might have had to help change things, to live, for the planet to live in its needs? And there's just a study out. No country in the world currently meets the basic needs of its citizen at a globally sustainable level of resource use. Right? This century, Kate Raworth said, calls for new metrics, natural and social, that enable humanity to thrive within the means of the planet. And yet we still have many strategies in our own countries looking at unlimited growth, right? Or based on unlimited growth. Another kind of model to think about is, again, coming back to China, is on a different level, maybe not so global, is that there's a very well accepted model of development that says first you grow institutions. Without strong institutions you cannot develop. It's very common. That is why a lot of aid and effort go into governance systems and building systems. China has shown that it's exactly not necessarily so, because they had weak institutions, and a lot of the development happened with weak institutions, because the weak institutions co-evolved with other development aspects. So they didn't first try to build strong institutions. And they don't think that works because of the system's nature of things, the fact that things co-evolve. Too much need to be in place and they have to evolve together. Right? So if we evaluate, do we consider that? No, I would bet. And then key findings from a capacity development evaluation report that found that a gigantic amount of money is spent every year on capacity development programs across the world. But so much is wrong with how we think about when we develop. Even though we meet objectives, even though we meet targets, even though we do what stakeholders, we evaluate what stakeholders want us to evaluate, we need to focus on how change really happens, because the theories on which these evaluations are based and the programs are based are not accurate. They need to consider underlying power politics, how much of our terms of reference talk to that, for example. Evaluations need to think more holistically about the capacity of systems, right? Let me skip to the third point, and I'm sorry, I'm rushing in the last 5 minutes that I have. So another very misleading issue, and one that I just touch on in spite of its importance, is insufficient consideration of societal dispositions, societal patterns, influencing efforts towards real sustained change. What does it mean in more simple language? It means that attention to context, and especially to culture, needs to have a much higher profile in what we do than it has. And it's not about, let's shake the chief's hand when we evaluate in the village or something like that. It's about far more fundamental issues. And I hope you can see, I mean, when you look at the fact these red circles are the cultural aspects of a society, citizens' cognition, the way in which they perceive things, the underlying assumptions and beliefs, the shared values, and then the expression, which is what we normally see in the rituals and the symbols, how we do funerals, how we do weddings. That's not the culture, it's what sits underneath, of course. And then the contextual elements, the norms, the interpersonal relations, the laws, the institutions, right? The physical, the economic, political environment, the global power constellations, and so on. When you look at the fundamental role that culture and philosophies play in all of our societies, and yet our evaluations very often act as if it's just, the locals will tell us what exactly is cultural. There's no depth to our analyses. As a very simple, very quick example, indigenous Alaskans, like many others, believe in cyclical theories of change. Everything is cyclical. And unfortunately, I can't go into detail, but for them, everything is about the process, not the end result. So their evaluations will focus far more on process and what was learned from the process. The end result, as such, has a diminished value. Also, many others, many indigenous people, of which there are not just indigenous tribes, but the whole of Africa is indigenous, have very different perceptions of how change happens and how things work. And the kinds of questions, there are wonderful analyses of kinds of questions, evaluative questions that are completely different. And I wish I had time to go into that. I don't. A very interesting, just to show how fundamental this can be, is the fact, and this is a simple evaluation process matter. Collectivism, African and Asian societies are far more collectivist, as you know, than Anglosaxon West societies. And in Asia, especially East Asia, people are far more aware of the middle way, not confrontational. Try to seek, not to be in conflict, a compromise, right? Avoid controversy, debate, the whole loose face thing that one always knows about in Japan and China and so on. That's it's very different to the individualist approach in the West, where it's far more insistence on the correctness of belief one above the other. Things are black and white. You are right, or you are wrong. You are bad, or you are good. Right? This is very much how we think in the West, as Europe, especially Anglo-Saxon West. This has very important implications, not just for evaluation processes and how we transfer and communicate, but for how we evaluate processes that have been going on during interventions. Right? In Bhutan, the fusion of Tantric Buddhism and animist Bonism leads us to interpret nature as a living system, very different to how we see it as something to exploit very often. Right? It's a completely different approach. So evaluation there will look at something completely different. So my last slide comes back. I know that there's some of you have been reading some of the posts that I've had. I haven't given solutions. I actually had questions to ask and, how can we approach this? And I realized it will be too much. So I just want to say that all of this has real implications for the evaluation questions that we ask, how we frame the evaluations and for the evaluation criteria that we use. And I've written a series of blog posts that have been very much debated and well received, I would think. Doesn't mean everybody agrees, but it's been well received in terms of raising debate, in where I say that we need to look at, and that's the lowest set, if we look at the characteristics of complex adaptive systems, for me it's a given that we have to look at criteria that speak to that. And some of what I've said does that. That's why coherence, significance of interventions, responsiveness and improvisation, impact sustainability, and then development effectiveness, contributions to development, for me are very typical of what complex systems thinking means for evaluation criteria. And for me, we have to look at those as potential criteria because of the reasons that I've given. And then the mandates, the values and norms of our organizations and specific stakeholder interests will give us flexibility in what criteria we apply. And I am really out of time. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions. Anyone got any questions? Yes.
Thank you. Really interesting discussion, and I think a lot of us would agree about the need for complex thinking in evaluations, particularly given a lot of development challenges now cross-border. So we're not looking at country-specific interventions or subnational, but actually cross-borders, cross-regional sometimes. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the incentives that funders, donors, and evaluation practitioners could create in order to move more towards this kind of thinking.
Yeah, it's such a difficult issue because we are all driven by different motivations, different incentives. And for a government funder, that country's interest will always be the most prominent, understandably so. So cross-border interests are usually secondary to national interests. And that makes this politically so difficult. And it's very understandable that incentives, I think, are often not there. Other than the slide that I had up there now, that the competition that there will be between countries to adhere to indexes and to be high on performance and don't want to see the red that I showed on some of the slides, I hope will be an incentive to try to address some of the issues that may otherwise not be addressed. There are, of course, many funders and governments that will be concerned about the global issues that we all have to deal with. But one is very aware of the competition between interested parties. So I cannot really give you a good response to what will be incentivized, other than in the case of, let's say, the refugee crisis, the very obvious example that it will be better for a country here if solutions elsewhere are found, so let's support those solutions. But in the end, it comes back to self-interest, and what will promote self-interest by working cross borders. That's essentially, I think, all one can. This could be a very interesting discussion in this audience, by the way. And just a very obvious, issues like migration, for example, it really is in the interest of the country to help collaborate to solve issues around migration as a region. So regional collaboration. There's just one more thing I want to mention. We must also not forget that there are networks of actors around the globe now that are tackling problems together because it's common problems. So not countries so much where there's potential for conflict, and maybe not companies where there's even greater potential for conflict, but more cities or collaborations, networks of organizations who, for their own reputation, want to work together to make major change. So you get some coalitions like that.
I like the direction of this, and in the context of the current discussions about the OECD DAC criteria, which are either being discussed or possibly will be under review, I think your last sort of blue box is very interesting. And I think that it would be, it would be helpful down the line to give a bit more, a bit more precision into what's meant by some of these aspects, because I think some of the current DAC review criteria have suffered a lot of use of the word relevance, and then they've just sort of used it however they want it, But I think it's really interesting, and I think that within that there could be room for prioritization given different situations, because of course, you can apply those criteria, and the people in country, as you've just said, they will prioritize some of those criteria in a different way than somebody doing the same evaluation but from outside. So I think that becomes rather important. The delineation of the perspective. So it's not just Tom, Dick and Harry wanted this and they happen to live in Iceland or what have you, but it's the particular perspective of the commissioning group actually needs to be much better explained in the beginning of some of these things, as well as the criteria.
I think, and I'm talking here to all of you who work in practice, right? I think there's way too little attention to the criteria that we use in order to determine whether something is good or not, successful or not, powerful or not, right? It really, now the blue box, as you say at the bottom, are, according to me, and I put it up for debate, issues that have to be looked at. You have to evaluate for this. You have to. If my argument that I've tried to present, just scattered bits and pieces in the last 45 minutes, then one has to look at those issues, or you will miss too many important elements, and you won't know what works and what you can call a development success or a success towards development. While the other boxes are very flexible, because it depends on the norms of the day. You know, the whole thing, let me put a controversial issue to you. This notion of no one left behind in the SDGs that everybody's so concerned about, it's nonsense. There's no way in which nobody will be left behind. But it is a great ideal, right? But it is a norm of the day. In 30 years, when everybody is equally well looked after, perhaps we'll have another norm. You know, it really does change. And it may change with the mandate of the organization. But the blue box at the bottom is not, in my view, are not negotiable. But some are very controversial, like significance. What does significance mean? So I believe one needs to have your rubrics that spell out how you interpret significance and why you say it's a significant intervention, or it's had significant impact, or it's made a significant difference.
Thanks. That was extremely interesting. I'm a public health researcher, and in public health we're starting to wrestle with these issues of complexity and what the implications are for evaluating changes. The thing that people often confront, I think, is this last stage of how you integrate all these different inputs in a transparent way. And so I'm just wondering, you know, some people would say, well, you can do it very formally and transparently and technically using multi-criteria decision analysis or whatever, but it has flaws. And I'm just wondering, you know, is there a way, is it actually possible to do that, to integrate all that information transparently and still call it an evaluation? Or is it just a matter of judgment? Do you just do it as a matter of expert judgment? And what's the right convincing way to do that, do you think?
You're right that this is probably one of the most difficult technical issues that people are grappling with. And everybody who does it, like, you know, the different banks, especially the development banks, are very, they do it. They try to make the assessments based on integration and summing there. And they all admit that it has the problems that you indicate. I do think that there will always be an element of expert judgment that has to come in. That's part of the art of evaluating. I think one also needs to recognize that in the end it is value-based. Who values what in development? But perhaps something that we can look at more carefully may relate to this whole notion that there is a certain development trajectory and there are certain things that have to happen before others. And if you take all of this into account, there's almost a technical reason why certain things would weigh more than others. And so we need to be thoughtful about what that may be. That may be that not so much value-based, but based on a more technical understanding of how things work from a complex systems perspective. So I don't have a ready-made answer for you, but I think it needs to be done. And I think we need to be working on how to do it better. What one sees most often now is because it's so difficult to do, it's not just a matter of adding together, is what we see is they run in parallel. So you've got 4 or 5 satisfied, 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, 1 out of 5, and it becomes meaningless. It really is meaningless. I also would like to just say that I think evaluation needs to make far more use not of statistical modeling or statistics, but mathematical modeling. So being much more aware of the value that mathematics might be able to add within this. So we need to experiment more with that. Sorry, I can't give you a pat answer.
No, that's really helpful just in terms of prompting me to think more about this.
Yeah, and I think it's useful to look at those who have been working on it, but they all admit it's still not ideal, but at least they do it. Many don't. So. There was another question.
It might be a really naive question, sorry, but if you're looking at things from a perspective that the system's really complicated and evolving in an unpredictable way, how can you have any confidence that the outcomes come from your intervention? And how do you compare against what you think would have happened if you hadn't intervened? Because the system's so unpredictable, I'm not quite sure what you compare against in an evaluation like that.
Yeah, there are many things to answer. So just to give you a quick answer, again, a very, very important issue. So the whole implication of complex systems is, as you indicate, the unpredictability of things. So there are some patterns that can emerge if one understands well enough how society works. To some extent, some things might be predictable, but largely unpredictable, as we know. So the whole notion of counterfactuals and what might have happened become much more. It becomes, in a way, perhaps, I wouldn't say redundant, but one should be much more thoughtful about what a counterfactual may mean in this environment. We always say that much more detective-like work needs to be done now, where detectives don't really work with counterfactuals, they work with factuals. So that's one element, and there's a lot to say around it. The other thing is that there is now, of course, a very big emphasis on adaptive management. So the worry that I have about adaptive management, where you evaluate all the time what's happening and you make adjustments as you go along, is that we think nothing is predictable. Right. Now, when you look again at China's development, that's not true, because the Chinese have 5-year plans. What's very critical in Chinese development, I'm sure many of you would know, is that they give a broad framework, and they give very specific targets. They have very rigorous accountability from people through 5 levels of government. But the people at the bottom of the pile, right at the local level, can experiment, and they have complete freedom to improvise. And because they're held accountable, it's a very merit-based system, and they want to make progress. So because they're held accountable, they try everything in different ways. And the big difference between how we look at evaluation and counterfactuals, I don't think that they ever, in China, used counterfactual evaluation in order to get their development done. They had targets that had to be achieved, but that freedom to experiment led to a lot of local solutions. And because they're quite autocratic government, they could quickly scale. And they scaled very rapidly. And they could even change institutions, which in our case would take years and years to do, because it will be politically unsavory for a democratic system. They could scale very quickly and change very quickly. So all of these make for a very different way of thinking about development and about the evaluation of development than counterfactual thinking. So I think we need to experiment more with the alternative ways of thinking about it. Not throwing counterfactuals out, it will always be important for impact evaluation, but we need to be open for the lesser counterfactual, non-counterfactual thinking, more factual thinking.
I'm afraid we've gone over time there for today, but if anyone else has got any questions, feel free to email us and perhaps we can pass them on to you directly.
You are very welcome. I'm easy to find. If you want to email me, the easiest email address is just zenda.ofir@gmail.com. So please feel free at any time to be in touch. I love debating. I never feel I learn enough. I don't have most answers for questions that I myself ask. So I would love to share with you some perspectives on this and also your experiences. What I would like to ask is, any of you with power to do so, please experiment with some of these ways of thinking and the criteria and see where that takes us. Because nothing is a pat answer. There's not enough case studies that one can say this works or that it doesn't work. It's just we need to be open in how we think in this kind of environment that we are now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.